Welcome to the Elevating La Cultura podcast, a space where I talk with Latinas who are passionate about what they do and are willing to share that passion with others to change the narrative, especially for the next generation. Each season is centered around different topics, but all with a Latina perspective. Welcome to Season 8, where we will talk all things corporate and higher education. I'm so excited to share these powerful stories. So vámonos, and let's get into it. Lauren Muñoz is a writer, lawyer, and former teacher living in Southern California. She received her JD from Northwestern University in Chicago, where she frequently skipped class to commune with her sun lamp. When she's not reading, she can be found knitting, crocheting, and collecting recipes for things she'll never bake. Suddenly a Murder is her debut novel, and I'm excited to learn more about her journey. Hi, I'm so excited to get into this conversation. Today I'm chatting with Lauren, and it's a unique way of how I got connected with her. I know that your team reached out, and I am really excited to get into your book because my daughter has just legit loved reading your book. And so I am excited to hear the journey of what brought you to where you are and then talk about the process of writing your book. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? I know I get too excited and I don't want to say too much before we get into the questions. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Lauren Muñoz. I'm a real estate attorney, and I just got my debut book out. It's called Suddenly a Murder. It's a YA mystery for teens with Penguin Teen, and it's about 7 teenagers who throw a 1920s party at this glamorous estate on a private island until one of them turns up dead.
It's interesting to have a kid who is in that age of very into murder mysteries. I think of when I was a kid and I was really interested in deeper books like that story, that mystery type story. And it's just been fun getting to see my daughter love reading, but then love falling in love with this genre. And I'd love to know the story of what brought you to where you are today. You said that you have done real estate. What is the journey? Tell me.
Yeah. So going to law school, I wasn't actually even sure that I wanted to go to law school. So when I was young, it was funny. It's actually kind of weird because when I was young, the two things I wanted to be were a writer and a lawyer. And I ended up in exactly that place, although the journey was a little bit, kind of back and forth. So when I went to college and got a degree in English literature, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to go get a PhD or go to law school. I wasn't sure sort of which track I wanted. Both of them sounded really appealing. And I had my favorite professor. I had taken a number of classes with her, and she suggested that I take some time off. She said, look, before I went to grad school, I taught for a couple years, and I think it's a really great way to really focus on what you want to do. Take that time away. So that's exactly what I did. I went and taught public school. I was living in Texas. So I taught public school for a few years. And by the end of it, I was sure that it was law school that I was going to choose. So applied to law school, went to law school in Chicago, actually. I went to Northwestern. From there, I went to school intending to be a criminal attorney, actually. And law school is strange because certain schools, they can kind of push you in a direction sort of towards corporate law. It's not that the school does it. It's just that there's a lot of the corporate attorneys and the corporate firms, they get a lot of attention on campus. And I'd never been around that before. I didn't know any attorneys before I went to law school. My parents aren't attorneys or anything like that. And so that was really intriguing, that opportunity to, see that. And so I sort of ended up, flitting towards that path instead, partly because it's expensive to go to law school and you take out these loans. And the best way to pay them back is that if you can land one of these big corporate jobs, that's really helpful. And so that's what I did. I was in Chicago. I worked there for a couple years. Went to Denver and then Dallas, worked there in big law for a few years, then went to LA and worked there in big law for a couple years, and corporate real estate, that was a thing. So, and then I had met a friend, a guy at my Dallas firm, and he ended up going out on his own. And he was like, "Hey, do you want to, work with me?" And at that point, I was definitely ready to exit out of big law, and into something smaller. So I've been working with him for a while now. And in terms of the writing, I was one of those, kids who wrote a lot. I wrote, little stories for my friends on the bus. The librarian at my school, they published little books that was very cute. And that was, a big sort of thing that I liked. And then it dropped off. In high school, I didn't really think about it, so much again. In fact, I didn't really think about it again until I was in law school and thinking to myself, I'm not really sure, if law is the only thing I want to do or if it's the thing I want to do. And so after I graduated, I started writing again. And it was kind of off and on because these corporate jobs, the big law jobs are really intense. They require huge numbers of hours. And it was difficult for me, at least, to balance that with trying to be creative when I was, at work late at night often. So once I moved out of, big law and in between my big law jobs, I would write. And I wrote a number of different manuscripts. I started out with middle grade and then started moving into YA. And it was actually when a few years ago, I read One of Us is Lying. It's a book by Karen McManus. And she's really, it's really a great time for mystery. It's a great time for your daughter if she loves this genre, because One of Us is Lying was such a big hit that it created a lot of space in the market for a lot more mysteries. And I read that and I thought, the very first manuscript I ever wrote was actually a middle grade mystery. And it seemed, with the lawyer thing, my interest in criminal law and my interest in writing, it seemed like a great thing to sort of, mix together and give a try myself. And at the time, I was doing a huge reread of Agatha Christie because I love Golden Age detective fiction, which is this genre from like the 1920s and 1930s, mostly in England. Agatha Christie's the big, name from there, but there are a lot of people. They sort of established this traditional style of mystery, and I loved it. I've loved it for a long time, and I was doing this huge reread of Agatha Christie, and I was just thinking like, how I would love to write something like this, but I don't want it to be historical. I want it to be modern, and how do I do that? And so I wrote this book and, went through the query process and got an agent, and then they sold the book. And here we are debuting.
I think of my daughter who is, I'm Mexican American. My daughter is Mexican American. And she was talking about the representation in the book and how she really appreciates when there is representation in a way that doesn't feel like in your face or like tokenizing. And I think that's something that like I did not have when I was younger and a young adult and reading a lot of books. And so it's something that I am intentional about seeking for both my kids, seeking representation when it comes to authors, seeking representation when it comes to the content in the books. And so she was talking about the characters, and I was just like, I really appreciated the intentionality and the representation. I'd love to learn more about how you go through thinking of that process and like how your experiences influence your writing.
Yeah, I didn't have that either growing up. It was very much, Babysitter's Club, Sweet Valley Twins. Everybody was pretty much the same. All the characters were pretty much the same. And, in terms of, I like your daughter's point about that sort of the not in your face, because that's what I like too. I like diversity that's natural. I like it when it's inclusive, without necessarily drawing attention to the fact, because it takes me out of the reading experience a bit. So in terms of, for me though, it's just, I'm Latina. So my character is, it's not that your main characters aren't you, but at the same time, I like writing with a character who, has some of the qualities of me and qualities that I care about. And, and it's also important to me that, you know, teenagers especially do see that sort of just representation in place though, right? Where it's not so much about that as it is, there's a lot of, people like us in the world, and there should be more in books. And I'm really happy that, I get a chance to write that. So for me, it's also just that, because that's where my center is and my, thought process around it is, the characters sort of come naturally. So in that, one of the homages to the golden age of detective fiction is that my book has a detective in it, a consulting detective, and she's from Mexico. She's a Mexican detective. And it wasn't so much that I thought, I need to have a Mexican detective. How will I develop her? It just sort of came to me that that's, what I wanted for her character. It's what made sense for the plot. And, so I wouldn't say that I have I don't, it's not, in terms of intentionality, it is intentional, because everything is in books when you write them, but it's not even so much the focus as it is something that I like personally. I like it when casts of books and TV are diverse. That's the kind of TV I like. That's the kind of book I like. And so that's just going to be the kind of book I write.
Did you see that diversity through your educational journey? Like, I know that when I went to college, I was a small percentage of the people of color. I went to a predominantly white school, and that was just the norm for me. So I created this dual identity to kind of protect myself when I was interacting with my peers and when I was interacting with my family. So I am wondering how that part was for you in your higher education journey. Did you feel like that was lacking in your surroundings? I know that you went to school in Chicago, and Chicago is pretty, like, you can find a lot of diversity in Chicago, but sometimes that's not the case in the specific areas that you reside. So I'm curious as to what your experience was through your education.
Yeah, it took me a long time to even notice, actually. So I grew up in a very, very white area of Georgia, and in Texas. But and so I hadn't really. I guess part of it is that for me it already is a dual identity. It's my father who is Mexican American, not my mother, and so it wasn't really something that was drawn attention to even in my family as we were growing up. It's something that we sort of came into a little bit more. As it was something that my dad certainly noticed throughout his career journey. He ended up in sort of corporate America, and I mean, he was just, there was just nobody like him, no other Latinos. And so for me, it wasn't something that I really thought about when I was younger. And so because I had been raised in such a very white place and hadn't been thought of myself as any different than that in particular, when I got into college, I also didn't really notice it very much. I noticed that there were not a lot of people. I mean, there weren't a lot of, other Latinas. I didn't really meet very many, although I went to school in Texas. So in that sense, I met, a few. But for me, I just didn't even, until I was going to law school, I would say, is when I first started noticing that, like, it was very, very white. And law schools, they've tried to do a much better job of recruiting diverse classes. now they do an even better job than when I went to school a decade ago. But even then, they were, trying to recruit and encourage, diversity in their classes. But it still was very white. Even now, when you look at, percentages of how many lawyers are, Latino, it's like 6%, which is, a really, really low amount. So it was kind of then that I started, noticing. I still didn't feel, I mean, I would publishing, for publishing, it's another, well-known thing. In fact, I was just writing an essay about this for Publishers Weekly, that in publishing, it's about the same as lawyering, which is about 6% of publishing is, Latino. So these are small percentages. So as I've gotten older, I've actually noticed more and more the small numbers of people like me. And I think I'm glad that that people are recognizing it, right? But I think it's one of those very much more work to do things in all the different, areas, including publishing, because that's a very small percentage to be in publishing. And I think that, if you read the, YA books, it's also, I think that people think that there's more diversity than there is. And when you actually look for the numbers or read these books, you realize that it's still pretty low.
Well, let me preface by saying I know nothing about the journey of becoming a lawyer, just like I don't know anything about the journey of becoming a doctor or going into the medical field. I just know based on what I see on TV, like with Grey's Anatomy in the medical field, and all the lawyer shows like The Good Wife. And so I know that there is a part that I don't see, or there's it's not necessarily reality. And so I'm curious if you have any myths or insight as to the journey of becoming a lawyer and going through that higher education journey, because for many of us, we just see the what is put on TV and we're just like, oh, that'd be awesome to be a detective. That'd be awesome to be a lawyer, because we see it in such a glamorous light. But I'd love to hear from your perspective what that was like, getting to that place of finishing, graduating, and then getting a job in the field.
Yeah, so I think that, on TV, most of the lawyers are going to be, a lot of lawyers are going to be trial attorneys, because that's kind of the glamorous work. You're trying cases, you're trying criminal cases or corporate cases. But a lot of us are sit in our office and read lawyers. And that's sort of the, that's most of the job. At least it was most of my job. It's, for me, I didn't find law school, I'm not a terribly diligent student. So I didn't find law school terribly, a lot of people hate law school. I didn't mind it. I love school. I think that school is much better than working. Your schedule is better. Mostly you get to learn things and enjoy other people. And so I've always loved going to college. I would be a permanent student if I could. So I didn't mind law school too much, but it was not representative of what the actual job was at these big law firms. So my path to law school, I applied, got to choose my school. They gave me a merit scholarship, a lot of money. And so I ended up in Chicago. And law school is in between. So I got a big firm job after my first year. So basically during the summers for 13 weeks, you work at these firms. And at the time, I don't know if they still do this because, it might be a financial thing, but at the time they were spending huge amounts of money to just court us. We didn't have to do that much work. We got taken out to just the fanciest lunches every single day. There were a million events, and in being in Chicago, it was just fantastic because there was so much going on in Chicago. And we just got to you're drinking every night, you're having party. It was fun, honestly, because we didn't have to do that much. Then you graduate and you get the job, and it's very different. Suddenly, there are billable hours, lots of them, and the job becomes very high pressure, and in a lot of ways tedious. I've always liked lawyering more in theory than in practice. I love talking about legal issues. I like drafting legal issues. I like drafting arguments. But in terms of the day-to-day crunch time work, it requires a tolerance for being bored. And I think it's like a lot of these, high-powered jobs where there is a lot of detail-oriented work. It's great for your brain, but it's also hard on your brain. It's hard. But part of the difficulty is simply sticking with it all day, every day, and knowing that your life is not your own in a sense. Now, I can only talk to big law. Other jobs, in big law from a few years ago, but other jobs in the legal profession, I'm not sure. I think some of them have more balance, but these big law jobs, sort of the ones that pay really well, they kind of own your time. So sometimes you have a decent schedule, and the other times it's like, hey, we're closing this deal, cancel everything. And that's, it. So if you had work to do, you simply had to do it no matter what. There are nights that you don't get a lot of sleep, and there are deadlines you meet, and you do it because they're paying you a lot of money. One of the things that I was surprised at is, big law gets a lot of bad rap in terms of the people sometimes, in terms of the treatment. And I saw some of that because it's a place of business. But the thing that I loved most about working at a big law firm is how many smart people you're surrounded by, how many interesting people you're surrounded by. And I think that comes from a couple of things. First of all, a lot of education. But second of all, people had sort of the privilege of being able to do things that were interesting, right? That's what comes with making money. So a lot of these partners had money for a lot of their lives. And so they did these really sort of interesting things, and a lot of them took advantage, of the chance to sort of make themselves interesting. So I did like that part, but it is a grind. So you would never show that on TV because it would be extraordinarily boring to have me like read 18 million deeds on television, right? So in that sense, not terribly representative. Most of the time you're in your office, and for your breaks, you might go with a friend for coffee. And that's, kind of it. The highlight, of course, is that you get paid well, but you pay for that yourself in a lot of ways. So I think that in terms of, myths, I would just say that it is, even law school doesn't really prepare you for what you have to do. Law school is geared very much towards litigation. And so you have to very much learn on the job if you're going to do one of these, corporate positions.
Did you experience any imposter syndrome while you were going through this journey? I know that a lot of, you just said that it's a lot of work, and it can be shocking. And if you're not ready or aren't like prepared for that mentally, like it could be a drain. And it could affect your mental health. So I guess this is a two-part question. How did you preserve your mental health during this time? And did you face any imposter syndrome? Was that part of the shock of going from school to, I guess, job life?
I didn't actually, with as to the imposter syndrome, I did not experience that, partly because I had, so when you apply to law school, there are, and I think this has changed a little bit, but at the time the metrics were sort of your GPA plus your, LSAT score. And I had a great GPA out of college, and I had a very high LSAT score. And I got into to universities that were better than the one I went to. I went to a school that was a top 10 at the time, but I got into better schools. So when I went to school, I very much did not feel like an imposter. I felt very much like I belonged to that. So, and those again are metrics that they stop meaning things as you move on, but they're the metrics that people care about when you go to law school. And then transitioning into the firm work, I mean, it was difficult, but it was also something that I turned out to be good at, and got good feedback on. So in that sense, it was actually validating, as opposed to feeling sort of like an imposter. I felt very much like this is where I, can thrive and can kind of, belong. There's definitely a problem though with the mental health aspect, at least for me, I do not, it turns out, have the temperament to be a big firm lawyer because I very much care about disappointing people. And so the amount of pressure that I put on myself in general, but also at the law firm, was so extensive that it was nearly paralyzing. And I think that you have to care, in a sense. I think that if you want to do it long term, it's a little bit better to care a little bit less, and to have a little bit of distance from it. But I always wanted to please the partners. I always wanted to, impress them, that sort of thing. And I think that that makes you put, just so much pressure on yourself. And I don't think that, I mean, there were elements of it, again, being around a bunch of people that I found, interesting and smart was helpful for mental health. It's very engaging in that way. But in the end, I did not have the kind of lasting power that you need personality wise to stick under that much pressure. I was constantly thinking about it. Other people, I think, can turn off, they can go out at night or go home at night and like forget about it. But I was always on or thinking about it. And the first thing I was doing is like, checking emails and, not sleeping very well. So I think you definitely have to know yourself, in terms of whether you've got the personality to maintain that kind of pressure.
Hmm. Have you thought about like where that pressure comes from? Like this pressure to impress your bosses or this pressure to impress your teachers or your peers? Because I've experienced that too. And so I'm curious if you've thought about where that comes from.
I think culturally we put. I mean, I think there's a couple answers to that. I think culturally we put a certain sort of pressure on people who we label high performing in school. So I think one of the things that we do, and I have a lot of problems with how education is done in this country, but I think that we start sorting kids early into, oh, you're good at school. You're good at this limited number, this limited intellectual puzzle. You're good at it, and your teacher gives you good feedback. And I think that for a lot of people, whether it's your childhood, how you relate to your parents, or just how you were born, your personality, or sort of the cultural idea of, a Puritan work ethic, like they think there's a lot of elements of it, but you create this dynamic where you want people to think well of you intellectually. And so I think that a lot of people who end up going to these big law positions, they've been for a lot of their life considered, on the higher end of that particular spectrum in that limited sort of, intelligence area. Um, and so I think that you get used to that sort of feedback. It's kind of like, likes on a social media post, the dopamine hit of approval. And I think that that's kind of how they, get people to work under that level of pressure. And I think that you get a lot of that sort of type A people pleasing that actually gets drawn to the law in the first place, especially sort of that particular type of corporate law. So I think that it's kind of self-selecting in that sense too. I think people who are not like that might simply not do the job in the first place. So I think you kind of get a lot of that. But I mean, how you're raised is, part of it too. I always wanted to, please my dad. He was definitely a person with high standards for himself and other people. And, so I think that you sometimes get that kind of feedback in childhood too, that puts you on that path. But I do think that even parents who are like that oftentimes are part of a larger cultural idea that a certain type of work ethic is good, a certain type of intelligence is good. We've kind of limited the idea of like who we put on pedestals, or the fact that we put anybody on pedestals for things that they are talented at, and that's, kind of an overall cultural issue that I think parents can, easily buy into, especially when you've got, my dad, he was the first person to go to college, in his immediate family. His parents, of course, didn't go to college, and, um, very working class. And so for him, he definitely had this you know, American dream style perspective on how to get through, sort of succeeding in the United States. And I think that, gets conveyed down the line.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to that whole mentality of like wanting to please your parents because of their uh, their parents or their background or their experiences, and you feel like this pressure to kind of build upon that legacy. I'm interested in knowing what the conversations were with either yourself or your parents when you were deciding to step out of your lawyer position and maybe continue into a more creative field with your writing. What made you finally take that leap, and how were the conversations with the people around you?
Yeah, so my parents were very supportive. My dad, when I was 18, quit his corporate job to go teach bilingual education, to go teach elementary school kids in Texas. So he is, kind of an independent thinker in that sense. He didn't just continue along with something that was making him happy. He went and did something that he found a lot more fulfilling. And my mom is definitely of the like anything people her children do is brilliant, and she doesn't want us to be miserable. So she was happy that I was exiting, sort of the big law. She'd never thought it was a good fit for me, and but no, my dad was very supportive of that. I mean, he's definitely of the more practical kind, which is why I still have the relationship with the friend who owns has his own law firm and does work for that. So he didn't want me to stick with that. But yeah, all the conversations were really positive. I had in between jobs. So basically, what I would do is I would get a big firm job, work there for a few years, quit, write for a while till I ran out of money, and then I'd go back and get another big firm job, and then do that for a while, and then write again. So I was always sort of on this path of hoping that one of the manuscripts would get picked up, and I got lucky in that my interest in golden age detective fiction is now more popular sort of broadly in the culture. Knives Out is super popular, and so it's just part of getting published is just you write some, there are a lot of people with good manuscripts out there, but you have to get lucky in terms of timing. And so my interest in my book got lucky in terms of timing. So I mean, I was with writing, writing is a bit different in that I think it's a lot easier to have, if not imposter syndrome, it's very easy to feel like you're not capable of what you wish you were capable of, right? There's still that sort of element of, I mean, we've all read a lot of books. As an English literature major, read a lot of books. And so I'm always very critical of my capacity in that sense. And also you don't it's a little bit harder, especially when you have that personality where you want where you like a certain type of feedback, because you don't get it when you write in a lot of ways, or you get a lot of mixed feedback. And it's a very independent sort of, I'm sitting in my own living room typing this out. Is it trash? Is it great? And without sort of, it's hard to self-assess something that you write because you like what you write often, because it's from your brain. Yay, brain. So it's very difficult. It's a lot more chaotic in that sense, a lot less reassurance in the book industry, which is kind of wild. So that part of it, I think, has been more difficult because there's very little structure in a way. You're an independent contractor, you're writing your things, and they will take you as long as you are, selling and people like it. And there's not a lot you can do about a lot of those things except, keep writing. So that's been an interesting difference between going to this structured, law firm setting where results are kind of more immediate, to something like this where, I mean, I wrote this book in 2020 and it's 2023 and it's just getting published. So that's kind of the, how long it takes when you are starting or getting an agent and stuff. It took, a while. So in that sense, you're kind of working out in the wild.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear the timeline of things, because oftentimes we don't hear that it does take a long time. It's just like someone pops up and you think that it's been instant success.
Yeah.
And how do you deal or manage when you get negative feedback? Because as an artist, like you said, we are creating, we're pouring ourselves onto a canvas, onto a piece of paper, onto a design. And it is so hard when we get that negative feedback, even though art is subjective, like we take it personally. So how do you manage those emotions and your mental stability when receiving that feedback?
Yeah. I think it's helpful that this is sort of my third career. I think it's helpful that I, you know, was a teacher and helpful that I was a lawyer because I sort of have these things to fall back on mentally of success, like things in places where I was successful. I think if I was younger, this would be quite a bit harder. Um, in terms of criticism, it's not so much it's the uncertainty of this particular job that bothers me more than you know than any sort of criticism, because like you said, I consider books extremely subjective, art extremely subjective, and I always do have to, I remind myself that this job is not about writing. First of all, nobody can write a book that everyone likes, but this job is not writing a book that everyone likes. You're writing what people are assessing for you is the book marketable, and can it sell to the demographic that they're looking for, like it or not, and I don't particularly, but this is a business. Publishing is a business, and so it's not so much a comment on your writing or your book, good or bad, honestly. Like even the approval is not so much an approval of like, oh, you've written this incredible book. It's like you've written a book that we who are making judgments about what will sell think we can sell. Like ultimately that is what they're deciding on. So I, I'm lucky to have a really great editor who has a wonderful sort of bedside manner in how he approaches his edit letters. So I don't know if you had another author on here talk about this, but basically you turn in this manuscript and then your editor comes back with a big edit letter of sort of overall structural things that they have suggestions on. And then you do that for a couple more rounds. And then that's when you've got your book. So I've really loved, we have a really good rapport. I really love his thoughts on things. And so that's been very, very helpful. The other thing that I remember is that if you have a book published, you've done it. Like you've done it. You've made what you were attempting to do. So you've got an agent who picked you up. You've got a publisher who bought your work. To me that's been enough of that approval that I want to not have it be a big deal one way or the other. I think that it's also important to remember that it's weird because art and I guess athletics are the things that people feel like they can comment on about your job. Like when you're a lawyer or anything else, you might have a partner giving you a review or a principal giving you a review, but that's it. Your work product is not on display for people to like randomly comment on, online. So I think that if you want to write a book, you have to kind of be ready for that. You have to be ready for thinking around that. And I've been kind of lucky because it's not been really like a hardship or, bothered me too much. But I do honestly think that if I were younger, that it would be a lot mentally tougher on me, because it would be sort of like, I think if I were younger, I would think I would be so desperate for this to be my permanent job. I'd be so desperate for this to be my main job. I would think of the book as the main thing that represented me. But for me, it's one of the things, I've done. And I'm really happy that I get this opportunity because I've, wanted it, and I love writing. I just love the process. So I'm very happy about it. But I also have sort of a recognition that if it fades, or if, sales aren't great, or if the book deals stop coming in, that I have a lot to kind of go back on and enjoy and stuff. So
That's encouraging because my daughter, like I said, is an avid reader. She reads anything and everything. But she has also started writing her own pieces, like whether it's short stories or like poems. Like she loves writing, and I encourage, like, it's a balance. Like I encourage her to write for herself and what she enjoys talking about and creating, and like enjoy the process. But it's also hard for her to get any sort of feedback. And I'm like, let's let me help you separate your emotions from what you're creating, or like, let me help you separate your worth, your worthiness, your value, your sense of value from what you're doing, because like you are worthy and valuable as you are as a person, and it's not based on what you create. And that's something that I've had to unlearn in the years that I've been an adult. Um, but it is a balance, because you want to be able to encourage them to pour everything into like what they're creating and to give it their all and their best, but also help them understand that their productivity and the product that they put out is not their value, or like doesn't um, equal their worthiness. Like they're worthy as they are. Um, so I appreciate you sharing that. I'm curious as to what's next. Like, what are your big goals for the rest of the year? I know we're recording it at the beginning of, or at the end of Q3, beginning of Q4. And so I know that this book just recently came out. So what is next for you? What are the goals as you close out the year and as you look ahead to next year?
Yeah, so I'm writing another YA mystery. I've been doing that all summer. It's been bought but not announced. And so, my goal for the year is to, finish that strong, and, turn in a great first draft, hopefully, that people like. And if not, then be completely ready to, revamp it. I think that one of the nice things about getting to work with an agent editor team, like once you get there, is that you know that they have your career interests in mind, that everybody wants to produce the best possible thing they can. So I'm looking forward to getting feedback on the book, on the new manuscript. And I think in terms, I mean, I also, and then I'll have to think of another idea. That's the thing, is that it doesn't really, you stop writing, you turn it in, and you take one big sigh of relief, maybe clean your house a little bit, and then you're like, all right, what do I got next? So, and it's fun. I mean, it's fun because it keeps you kind of in that creative mode. So I hope to have another idea by the end of the year, and then I probably won't get comments back on this one until next year. So maybe take a little bit of relaxed time over the holidays. Be my goal.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, what does a day in the life of a writer look like?
Yeah, so mine is going to look a little bit different because of, well, in terms of scheduling. So I tend to write late at night. So I will typically get errands done and chores done in the first part of the day, first part of my day at least. And then I'll read. So I'll read for work, either something that I'm doing for research. I do a lot of research for books, both in YA genre and beyond it. And so then I'll do that work, read some nonfiction, and then I might edit some of the things that I did the day before. And then after dinner is when I really then buckle down and do maybe like 4 hours of writing and revising. And sometimes, depending, I mean, if things are going well, I'll just keep going. It'll be, 6 hours or something. And if things are going poorly, then it'll be, half that time. So it's really depends on the day and whether you're feeling it. Sometimes your brain just feels dumb. And on those days, I'll try to read more, or do a little editing, because you can do that when you don't feel very creative. And then when I do feel creative, then I'll try and like get as much done in a big swoop. So
Hmm, sounds great. What encouragement or advice do you have for the next generation, whether it's the next generation of people looking to become lawyers or maybe transitioning out of that into the creative fields?
yeah, I would say that my biggest piece of advice is to really decide what you want and not get swayed from it, in the sense of, if you go to law school and what you really want is to be a criminal attorney, don't get dissuaded by money, or the sort of idea of the sort of the glamour of things, right? Because it is fun when you're young to be like, oh, I work at Big Law, I'm this, I'm that, because it gives you this sense of, you've achieved something. But a lot of what you've achieved is sitting in an office for 12 hours a day. So, the realities of a lot of these jobs, and even writing. I mean, for people who want to write, I think a lot of people, their focus is very much on, oh, I can't wait for people to like my book. I can't wait for people to give me good feedback. I can't wait to say I'm a writer. That is not what your day is spent doing. Your day is not spent saying you're a writer. Your day is spent communicating with your editor and your agents sometimes, and making sure that really some really things that are fun, but also tedious and hard work. And it's also very business oriented. You're on social media promoting yourself, which is very hard for those of us who would rather no one know they exist. So there are difficulties there, and it's also yet another business. And you're expected to you don't just write a book and luxuriate in your success. You then are immediately writing another one. You're always, in motion. I mean, these are jobs. So I would very much write, for lawyering, go down the path that you think you'll find very interesting, the most interesting you can. And for writing, write what you want, write in the genre you want. It doesn't matter if you think it's trending or popular, because again, because of how long it takes to get from writing to publication, if you chase the trends that you think will help get you published, there are two things that are going to happen. It won't, because the trend will be over. And two, you will be writing something that you will not want to be writing. One of the things that I learned and did not know before going in is that there's this element of marketing to writers, where if you write one book, your team will often want you to write something similar because they want to brand you, essentially. That's sort of the business aspect of it. And so if you're going to write, make sure you're really, developing the writing that you like. It's better to not have some sort of society's version of success than it is to, be trapped in a type of job that you thought would be very different from what it was. So
that's great advice. Thank you so much. This has been a great chat. I want you to share, if you can, where people can find you, and share social media handles, websites, all the things.
Yeah. So for social media, mostly on Instagram, at Lauren Muñoz Books. And I'm on Twitter, but I'm not really. So that's Ren Muñoz Books. Website is laurenmuñozbooks.com. And you can find the book any retailer online. It got published in the UK at the same time. So if you're a British listener, it's over there too. So yeah, that's where you can find me in the book.
Awesome. Well, congratulations again. My daughter loves your book.
Makes me happy.
And so if there's any parents with young adults, maybe check out this book because it's a good one. She's read it multiple times. But thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you sharing your story and for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, we'll talk later. Bye.
Bye.
It was nice to hear from Lauren's perspective as a writer, lawyer, and teacher, and how she navigated choosing those points in her life. Okay, amigos, thank you so much for listening. There'll be a new episode every Tuesday, so after you listen, feel free to take a screenshot to post on Instagram and tag at Elevating La Cultura, or send me a DM. You can also comment on this YouTube video if you're watching online. I always like to hear from people and how they resonate with the stories that I share. So leave a review on Apple Podcasts so we can get more ears listening to these stories and we can continue elevating La Cultura. And if you haven't already, check out the website elevatinglacultura.com to see what in-person events I've got going on for you. And you can also check out the merch shop. Soon, I'm going to be reopening the doors to the Showing Up Latina in Business Mentorship Program, designed exclusively for Latina business owners and leaders. Since being a business owner for 13 years now, when with all the millions of pivots I've had to do, especially in the past 6 years, I found so much value in the people who I can bounce ideas off of, vent to, and who will cheer me on through all the challenges. Many of us are in a time of transition or pivoting and feel like we're on the cusp of something that's about to pop off in our business. If you're a solo entrepreneur, you know the struggle of doing all the things all the time and trying to keep up with all the new trends when it comes to social media. It can be overwhelming, which is getting in the way of faster growth. If you've been thinking it would be great to have an accountability person or someone to bounce ideas off of and brainstorm next steps with, I'm your person. All right, enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, evening, whenever you're listening, y nos vemos next week. Bye.